Seventh-day Adventists. He is tasked with representing people all over the country, all over the world, when they have religious liberty problems. I am pleased to introduce him, and his will be the next voice that you hear. Thank you.
Thank you, Carol, for Thank you, Carol, for that introduction. It's great to be with you this morning here in Wilmington, Delaware. I came up last night, and rather than come in this morning, you have a first service. I don't know if how many of you know that. I did not. And Carol's like, "Oh yeah, we need you here at 8:20." I'm like, "Great." So anyway, so I was able to come up here. But it's great to be here today. You know, religious liberty is, this time of year is an important time to me. Not only do I work on religious liberty, but it was about 12 years ago that I actually started my job. There's a whole story about leading up to that I won't tell this morning, but the Sunday before Religious Liberty Sabbath, I flew out I was living in the St. Louis area at the time, and had interviewed with the general counsel, the prior general counsel, and the man I would be replacing. And then the next Tuesday, they voted me at AgCom to work at the General Conference. I was scheduled to give the religious liberty sermon that next week in my local church, and so I did. And at the end of the sermon, said, in fact, this issue is so important to me, I'm going to leave here and go work at the General Conference in religious liberty. You will not be getting such a dynamic ending to this sermon, I'm afraid. It's a little different. But this is an important topic, and it's one that it's interesting. Growing up as a kid, my mother first thought that I would be a pastor. Then I turned 6, and she's like, "No, he's not going to be a pastor." She then said, "He's going to be our religious liberty guy." And so when prior to that, I called my mother up and said, "You know, I'm interviewing for the job of religious liberty attorney for the General Conference." She's like, "Yeah, I know. I've been praying for that for a long time." And then I called her up and said, "Well, I didn't get the job. They offered it to someone else." And Mom's like, "I don't care. I'm still praying for it." I'm like, "Mom, you don't understand. This is not how things work. They offered to someone else. They voted that person accepted." She says, "I'm going to still pray." A couple months later, my future boss emailed me and said he backed out. So sorry for him, but no getting around Mom's prayers. It was around 1946 when a man by the name of Ren Fox in southeast Kansas was working for the Sinclair Pipeline Company as a gauge operator. Ren Fox was a religious man, but not a churchgoer. And he would, I'm going to be moving around a lot, so you're going to get a lot of use of moving that. And he would, his practice was that he would go on Sunday morning, starting 8 o'clock until noon, he would listen to all the, well, it wasn't then old-time radio preachers, but he would listen to all the radio preachers. These were gentlemen who, for the most part, had started out in radio. You know, it wasn't that old of a medium at the time and been popularized. And these were the old-time radio preachers. And that's what he would do each Sunday. And they didn't go to church. And he would send his tithes and offerings to whichever radio preacher he happened to like the best. And, of course, one of those preachers that he would listen to on Sunday morning was a man by the name of H.M.S. Richards. And the program, of course, was Voice of Prophecy, still around today. And as part of that, H.M.S. Richards had invited people to send in for Bible studies. And so he had written off for the Bible studies and was going through those. In fact, that Voice of Prophecy Bible study course still exists to this day. And he was going through them, and his job, though, while he was going through this, changed. And all of a sudden now, they were going to, from the regular schedule that he had that was going through seniority. And Ren Fox was at the lowest man on the seniority poll. And so therefore he only got stuck with what was left. And what was left was Friday night and Saturday night off on third shift. So he's going to be working the swing shift, and he's going to be working on Friday night and Saturday night off. And of course, swing shift is from midnight to 8 a.m. He was very upset about that, because one of the things that meant was it was going to be harder for him because of his new schedule and everything to listen to his Sunday morning programs because of the sleep schedule and everything. He also just, didn't like having to work the swing shift and didn't like his days. Right after that happened, the very next Bible study he got in the Voice of Prophecy was on the Sabbath. And Ren Fox was the kind of man who, when he became convinced of something, was going to do it no matter what the consequences. And after he'd studied the Sabbath, he went in to his wife, Edna Fox, and started crying and said, "The Lord has answered my prayer to have Sabbath off before I even ask it." And had never heard of a Seventh-day Adventist, had no idea who they were, didn't know about the Sabbath. The next week, him and his 3 kids, Joe Levon, Gayleen, and Rex Fox, showed up to the Ottawa Seventh-day Adventist Church, wholly unexpected, and said, "We studied and we want to become Seventh-day Adventists." A few years later, his middle daughter, Gayleen, would get married, and they would eventually, her and her husband would eventually have a son who stands before you today. Sabbath and Sabbath keeping is an important part in religious liberty of the Adventist Church, and it's been part of our heritage from the very beginning. Religious liberty is built into our DNA. It is just as much as Adventism as the Sabbath is, as the state of the dead. And it is part of our eschatology, part of our belief how the world will end. And we've been struggling with religious liberty in the United States, where we were founded, and around the world since our founding in the 1860s. And for those of you who may not be Adventist here this morning, I'll try not to make this too Adventist-centric, but it's been part of our belief system from the beginning. When we first founded as a church, our issues were a little different than they were today. We had Sabbath issues, but they were more along the lines of Sunday observance laws, laws that prohibited you from working in your fields and required you to keep Sunday holy. Well, those laws still exist a little bit. It may not be able to go to Walmart on Sunday. For the most part, that isn't an issue today. It was back then. We had church members in Tennessee who went to jail because they violated the Sunday laws. In fact, one of those cases was headed towards the Supreme Court, and if the gentleman hadn't died, it's very likely that that case could have made some law back in the day. We also, of course, had problems with the Civil War around our founding and conscription into the military, which had issues of bearing arms and also Sabbath issues. And that was a challenge when we first started. Going into the early part of the 20th century, we had, again, military conscription issues with the First World War. And the church wasn't really prepared for that. And so the church set up, after the First World War, the medical cadet program, which I don't see anyone here really old enough to have participated in that, I guess during the Vietnam era. But that was a program in which we trained our young people at our academies and our colleges to be military cadets. So when they were conscripted into the military, they could serve as a military cadet. And it was that program and really the ideology around that, of course, that gave us Desmond Doss, and which everyone now knows about thanks to Mel Gibson. And so we continued to have this military problems. We also, of course, during that time period and after the post-war period, we started to have more issues with labor unions and working and being members of unions as this country and unionized environments became more common. as an aside note, and this isn't discussion, Sister White's comment on labor relations and labor unions are a lot more nuanced than we as a church often have focused. We've usually focused on the labor union portion and not on the responsibility of businesses to treat their employees fairly and so forth. So that issue continued. But as time continued, you know, we ended the draft in the early 1970s, and so while there's still issues with our young people serving in the military, it's not really a religious liberty issue per se, or it's less of one because they've joined there voluntarily. And now most of the time when we have issues within the military, it's usually people who were promised something and weren't delivered, or they become reconvicted in their faith while in the military. Also, labor unions have become less and less of an issue. As the United States, for better or worse, has become less unionized, we have less problems with labor unions. And there's protections and things like the National Labor Relations Act and civil rights laws that mean most church members in the U.S. get protections. In 12 years I've been at the General Conference, we've had very few labor union issues in the United States. But instead, other problems have begun to develop. As our church membership changed and where they work changed, issues in the workplace became an issue. And as workplaces became less of the standard Monday through Friday and things like 24/7 crewing and working 7 days a week, and as factories and workplaces became more 24/7, that became more Sabbath problems. I mean, think about it. 20, 30 years ago, how many places that are open now on a Saturday and on Sabbath weren't before, and how many factories and how many other places have expectations of their employees. So those issues have always been there, but have increased and become more problematic. We also saw, beginning in the late 70s and early 80s, really in many regards as a reaction to Roe versus Wade, we saw the rise of what back then was called the moral majority, what's been referred to as the religious right, and an injection of moral and religious belief into the political process. Historically, the church in America, before that time period, churches had viewed themselves as apolitical, as not getting involved in politics. And starting really in the 1980s, Jerry Falwell and that group, that shift began to change. That began to shift. And churches became more and more involved in the political process. And we see that today, but we really started to see the rise of, and this concerned Adventism because, of course, of our eschatology and our belief that apostate Protestantism will combine with the government to oppress God's people. And we started to see that rise in the 1980s and into the 90s. And we still, of course, see the involvement of religion and politics today. But beginning in the mid to late 1990s, there was a shift, became a change. And all of a sudden, the issues of religious liberty that we were facing in the United States, we still had the Sabbath problems, but we also began to see what's been known as a rise of what's been known as the conflict of rights. And that is where you have differing civil rights concerns, and those now are beginning to conflict in various ways with religious liberty rights. And we see that in two particular areas, especially in the United States and other Western countries. And that's issues of LGBT and reproductive rights. And we see that manifest itself in a number of ways. I mean, this in Canada, for instance, there is a pretty big debate going on now. They have a summer jobs program where the government will pay for summer jobs for youth, but and nonprofits can participate. But for nonprofits to participate, they have to say that they believe in and support Canada's view on human rights, which says that women should have equal, affordable, and immediate access to abortion. And for a lot of organizations up there, that's a problem and don't want to check that. So in other words, if you want to participate in the Canadian Summer Program, if you're a pro-abortion group, you can do that. If you're a pro-life group, you cannot. And even churches and even organizations, for instance, that whole focus may not be pro-life issues, for instance, a summer camp, don't feel comfortable signing off on this. We've seen this in the United States in other ways as well. Masterpiece Cake Shop. Jack Phillips runs a cake shop, makes wedding cakes, doesn't want to make those wedding cakes for same-sex couples. Which right has precedent? The right of a same-sex couple to not be discriminated against in the provision of services in the public domain, what's known as public accommodation, or his religious right not to make a cake and support a cause that he doesn't agree with. Or, again, Hobby Lobby, a company which is right for them not to pay for certain types of contraception that they feel are abortifacients, or the right of the women there to get cost-free reproductive rights as they would with any other secular employer. So we're now seeing, and we're now in the era of, well into the era of conflict of rights. And that in the United States is the current dominant issue when it comes to religious liberty. Now, as an aside, and outside the United States, that becomes less of an issue. We continue to suffer significant problems in certain parts of the world with sharing the faith and religious liberty. Places like Iran, Afghanistan, Iraq, places, believe it or not, at one time we had a fairly robust ability to practice our faith, are now hugely problematic. We saw recently there was an issue in Bolivia where they'd passed an anti-proselytization bill in Bolivia, which looks like it's going to get repealed. But in the Western worlds, in the developed world, United States, Europe, Australia, it is now the conflict of rights era. But no matter what the issue that we've been dealing with as a church since our founding when it comes to religious liberty, there's been some guiding principles that we have followed. And the guiding principle that we have followed is, and hence the title of the sermon, is that people should have the right to make a decision about how they're going to conduct their religious life and their moral life, even if we think it's wrong and even if the government thinks it's wrong. It's the right to be wrong. And this is an important and sometimes very counterintuitive for us to think as Adventists and as Christians and as people who believe in the Bible and believe that God commands us to do certain things and conduct ourselves in certain ways. Because we have believed, and we believe, that people have the right to make their own decision. And if people have the right to make their own decision, guess what? Sometimes they're going to get it wrong. Sometimes they're going to rebel. And in fact, that's what the entire great controversy was about whether or not people had the right to not follow God or if they've only followed him out of fear. And this position that we as a church has taken has led to some very interesting positions. Back in the early 1990s, there was a case of two gentlemen from Oregon, I believe, Pacific Northwest, Oregon or Washington. I always get those two confused. And they worked at a high school as employees, and as that, they were subject to drug testing. And they took the drug test, and it came back positive. And the school wasn't very happy about this for a couple of reasons, not the least of which is their job was to be drug counselors. And the school felt that while maybe some you don't really need to be using this to counsel, and that the drug-using drug counselors was a problem. So they fired them. And the question became, was this a for-cause firing so they could get their unemployment? And they said, wait a minute, we didn't just use these drugs for recreational, we used them as part of our Native American religious ceremonies. We ingested peyote as part of our religious ceremony. And therefore, we get protection. In this case, went to the U.S. Supreme Court. And it had a very bad outcome as an aside, but the Adventist Church was on the side of the drug-using drug counselors in that particular case. Now, this morning's sermon is not on our health message, but I can assure you that our health message does not include the ingestion of hallucinogenics. either recreationally or for religious purposes. Yet, we were on their side. There was another case later in the 1990s in which some Cuban immigrants were down in the city of Hialeah, Florida, which is a suburb of Miami. And this was a relatively new immigrant group at this point. And one of the things that these immigrants were doing is they were going around and making these little altars as part of the Santeria religion, which is otherwise known as voodooism. This upset the city council and town fathers. In fact, one of them said, listen, Fidel Castro doesn't put up with this stuff. Why do we have to? The Fidel Castro interpretation of the First Amendment. It's a rather unique take on it. And so they decided to pass a law. And that law said, if you want to kill a chicken, you can't do it for a ritualistic purpose. Now, if you want to kill a chicken to make a chicken McNugget, that was fine. That's, of course, assuming there's actually chicken in a chicken McNugget. But if you do it as part of a ritual, that's banned. And so this case went all the way again to the U.S. Supreme Court. And the Adventist Church was on the side of the chicken-killing, Santeria, voodoo-worshipping practitioners. We do not believe in voodooism. In fact, in Sabbath school, the children's Sabbath school, I don't know how the mission stories are now, but they'll talk about, converting someone in the witch doctor, it's a little different, that's more African indigenous, but voodooism as well, all comes from the same place. That, that they have no power, that this is a false religion. You've heard of fake news, this is fake religion. And that's what we teach in our Sabbath school classes. Yet, we took a very public stand in the highest court in the land on the side of the people practicing voodooism. This is a little different, but when the gay marriage case, Obergefell, went to the U.S. Supreme Court, there was one church, and one church only, that said, our concern is only on the religious liberty issue. Whether you, the government, adopt same-sex marriage, secular marriage, or not, is up to you. We believe in a biblical marriage. This is our stance on marriage. What you do isn't going to change us one way or the other. But the only thing that we're concerned about is the religious liberty implications of this. And you, court, need to protect the religious liberty, even if you do grant same-sex marriage across the country. And that opinion got cited. And that's not necessarily intuitive that we do that. There's a lot of people that say the Bible set up marriage in Eden, and marriage needs to be followed, and we should stand up for biblical marriage. And we do stand up for biblical marriage. It's what we teach, it's what we practice. So why is it the Adventist Church has taken stands that ultimately and many times seem to be very counterintuitive? And I want to suggest that there's three reasons. I'm going to talk about those. It's in our best interest, it's what God desires, and it's what protects both government and the church. How many of you have heard the phrase, "This is a Christian nation"? How many have said, "This is a Christian nation"? You guys need to take up a collection offering and mount your projector on the ceiling. It keeps me from moving over this way. Elvis, I don't know, does he walk around or does he stand behind the pulpit? How many have said that? This is a Christian nation. But let's think about that. What does that mean, this is a Christian nation? Let's think about that in some other contexts. Saudi Arabia is a Muslim nation. And it's illegal, with a few exceptions, if you're an expat worker, sort of, to practice any other religion than Islam in Saudi Arabia. In fact, if you read the law strictly, to say a silent prayer that's not public at all to Jesus would be violating Saudi Arabian law. That's what it means to be a Muslim nation in Saudi Arabia. Is that what we want this country to be, a Christian nation? Let's say that that's what happened. And there's people, I remember talking to a woman, and the issue was, it was the combination of two religions, Baptists and Friday night football in Texas. And in Texas, they're back again in the 90s. All my stories seem to be from the 90s, sorry. There was some questions about having prayer before a Friday night football game at a public school. And the Supreme Court had said that that was unconstitutional. And I was talking to this lady, and it's like, well, you know, the Christians, you know, in other countries would be very happy not to have state-sponsored prayer. But she said, but this is our country. And you got to ask yourself, if we made this a Christian country, then there would be a day of worship. What would that day of worship be? Yeah, it ain't going to be Saturday. I mean, just go by the churches on Sunday and see how many more cars and how many other more parking lots than there are here. And so, when people say this is a Christian nation, what does that mean? What it's going to mean is what the majority want it to mean, or those who are in power. And in some places, you know, if it's decided by the municipality and you happen to live in Keene, Texas, or Collegedale, Tennessee, or maybe even Loma Linda University, or Loma Linda, California, Loma Linda University, maybe there we'd be okay. But the reality is, Adventists are a minority in most parts of the world, in most parts of the country. And in fact, everyone's a minority somewhere. Saudi Arabia, majority Muslim, dominant majority Muslim. In the United States, Muslims are a minority. If you're in Burma and you're Muslim and you're part of the Raghul people, I'm mispronouncing their names, people, not only are you a minority, but there'll be some pretty horrific oppression. I was reading a story in the New York Times a few weeks ago about how the Burmese government and Burmese people are treating that minority, and it's horrific. Some of the stories there, and I've read a lot of bad stuff that's been happened. This was some of the worst stuff. Of course, in other Muslim countries, Christians and others aren't treated a whole lot better. Everyone's a minority somewhere. And it's only in your best interest as a religion to stand up for the rights of everyone, so you'll have some rights where you're a minority. So, we as Adventists have always taken the position that religious liberty isn't just for us, it's for everyone. Self-interest is probably one of the least noble reasons to do something, but it also is one of the most effective. But we really shouldn't do things just because they're in our self-interest. We really should be doing them because that's what God asks us to do, and it's biblically required. And I think that's clear. God wants to give us freedom of choice, and he's given it to us. You know, I don't know how many served in the military, or the U.S. military, but there was a saying, we can't make you do something, we can only make you wish you had of. And that's really how government works. The government really can't make you do anything. They can just restrict you. God wasn't in that way. God can really make us do stuff. He could have created a bunch of beings who followed him just like we got to breathe, had to follow him. He didn't do that. He gave us the choice. John 1:4-18 says, there is no fear in love, but perfect love drives out fear, because fear has to do with punishment. The one who fears is not made perfect in love. God calls us to follow him out of love, not out of fear. You know, our responsive reading this morning talked about paying taxes, and it said we should pay taxes to support those, you know, whose full time is public service. Now, tax season is coming upon us. How many of you will be paying your taxes for your love and desire that federal employees get their paycheck? I don't know if there's anyone who's a federal employee. No, we pay our taxes because if we don't, eventually someone's going to come up and throw you in jail. And they'll throw you in jail for not a long, and then they'll also take your stuff on top of that. You know, driving up last night, I was going down the interstate, more or less following the speed limit. But, you know, I could have broken it more. Why didn't I? Well, you know, Maryland and Delaware have these guys that'll pull you, and women, that'll pull you over. We follow the laws because if we don't, bad things will happen. That's not what God calls us to follow him. Now, this doesn't mean there's freedom from consequences. There is a penalty or a consequence for not following God, and that's called sin. And the wages of sin are death. But the fundamental accusation that Satan made against God was that people follow you out of fear and not out of love. And God said, no, they follow me out of love because if they don't, because they love me, and sin has its natural path. And for the rest of the universe, that question was answered at Gethsemane. For us on this earth, we're still suffering from those consequences and still that has to play out. But God calls us to follow him, again, out of love, and not because we fear the consequences. But if we start passing laws that says you have to worship on Saturday or you go to jail or you can't, you know, hold any job or you can't buy or sell or whatever, why are people going to keep Sabbath? Because of the bad things that will happen. And that's not what God wants from us. And that's not how he wants us to serve him. God also understood that mingling of church and state weakens both institutions. Government does not benefit from having religion injected into it. Now, that doesn't mean that people who serve in government can't be religious, and it doesn't mean they can't use their religious beliefs and practices as guiding principles in making government decisions. But if you're trying to write tax policy and trying to figure out what the income rate is, do you really want to listen to a pastor who says, well, or a theologian who says, I've studied the Bible and I believe that the income rate and the corporate tax rate should be 21% or whatever it is, or 20%? No. The Bible is there to give us guidance in our life and to give principles, and taking care of the poor and the weak and the widow is something that we often forget when we're talking about that, but those are principles. You don't benefit by saying, well, there's one biblical prescription about how to do health care. But it also weakens the church. The Adventist church historically is like to talk about some of the corruption that injected itself into the Christian church in the Middle Ages. But it's easy to forget how that occurred. When religion in the church takes on the mantle of government, who over the years, over the decades, over the centuries is going to want to be head of the church? Those who are wanting to spread its gospel and serve God, or those who instead desire political power and the power of the state and are willing to do that by whatever means necessary? The history of churches being corrupted in their political, in their power, in their leadership, and in their policies by being part of the state is long and widespread. State-sponsored churches have almost always become corrupt and problematic. God has called us as Christians to defend the right of people to make decisions as their own, to come to him out of their own personal conviction and out of their own belief and not out of fear. And as Adventists and as Christians, it's our job to stand up for those, even those who we think are morally and biblically wrong, to give them the right to be wrong. And we stand up for this religious liberty in a number of ways. We stand up for it in how we engage in public society, who we vote for, what we say, how we conduct ourselves, by being involved public citizens, by being involved voters, by being involved Americans or whatever country or public area we come from. We also do it by supporting the church's religious liberty work. After this, Carol's going to show you a video of an example of that. And you will, I'm sorry, you're going to get your full-on Tod today. I'm in the video as well, probably more times than I should be. But we support that by supporting Liberty Magazine, by supporting the campaign, and by supporting religious liberty. And this, of course, is the time of year in which we do make an appeal for people to support it with your finances. And we ask you to do that according to your need and according to how God impresses that upon you. Those funds go to support the magazine and to influence people, and it also goes to support our religious liberty work and the Sabbath work and the work that we do to support our church members and others who have called up, who stood up for God. And you'll see an example of two of those. But God calls us to be his witness. He does not call us to be his enforcer. You know the little children's song, "This Little Light of Mine"? This little light of mine, I'm going to let it shine. I'm not going to sing for you. It does not say, "This flamethrower of mine, let it consume all who disagree with me." We're to be his light. We're to be his salt. We're to be his witness. We're not to be his enforcer. And so as we close today, I call upon us as Adventists and as Christians to defend the rights, especially those that we disagree with, especially those who we think are wrong, and to witness to them and to be an example to them, but not to try to enforce God's will and to use government to do that. Shall we bow our heads in prayer? Eternal Father in heaven, as we close today and get ready to go for this next week, we ask that you be with us and let us be a light and to be your shining light in our neighborhoods and our areas, and that we defend those who are your servants, who are your children, who you love just as much as anyone, and that it be your God light and your belief that convicts them and not us trying to force them. And we ask these things in your holy name. Amen.